Hi everyone, this is Achyuta Baba from Nightlight Astrology. I'm doing a live Q&A session this afternoon. I did one a couple of weeks ago, and I had quite a few people who asked me to do one again, so I thought I'd give it a try this afternoon. We'll see if not sure if my internet is. I'm not sure if it's streaming live. If it is, if you guys can see me and hear me, would you let me know in the chat box? That'll help me know that I've. Oh, good. I can see someone there. Awesome. So, couple of things that I want to promote today, and then live Q&A. So if you have any questions at all about astrology, please feel free to drop in the chat box. Just taking some time to answer whatever questions you have about astrology. Also promoting my upcoming course, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, which starts on June 14th. So I'm pretty excited. That class is kind of a unique one because there's been a bigger enrollment than we've ever really had before. And I think that's probably due to a lot of people being at home. We've also created a COVID-19 discount for people who maybe want to take the class but are on unemployment temporarily or out of a job on a budget. So there's definitely options for you to take the class that way if that helps. And there's also payment plan and the early bird rate, which is $500 off the normal rate. So you can check all that out on my website, nightlightastrology.com, and the courses page. If you're a little bit more advanced, I do have a horary class that's starting on the 14th as well. And then my year 2 class starts on Saturdays. And you've already had to have some kind of background in Hellenistic astrology to dive into my year 2 class. So I'll be promoting the program as I go today, just kind of plugging it here and there and telling you more about it. But I'll try to do it intermittently while also taking your questions. So whatever questions you have about astrology, I'm happy to take a look at them. There's some already in the chat box that I'll try to dive into here in a second. I just ask that they not be too specific to your chart, because the general answer to every question about a chart is the same. I can't tell unless I see the whole thing and really spend some time with it. And we can certainly do that in a reading. I have readings on my website. You can check those out if you want. But try to keep your questions as general as possible and not so specific to your own chart. Like, what about this planet in this house, or something like that. A lot of the times the answer is, well, I need to see about 10 other I need to see about 10 other things in the chart, take a look at before I could really give a proper response. So anyway, okay, so what is my philosophical opinion on electional astrology from the Green Cat? Well, electional astrology to me is it's been around for a really long time. Electional astrology is one of the earliest forms of astrology, along with mundane astrology. Mundane astrology being the state or shape of the nation or a country, and rulers or kings in the ancient world would use astrology to understand when to go to war or how the crops were going to do, when there would be famine or drought, as well as the timing of dynasties and concerns about royal families and stuff like that. It was pretty radical when astrology developed into what we now know as horoscopic astrology, because essentially individual birth charts became the most popular form. And that shows a revolution spiritually in what we're valuing: the elites and the leaders and the state and the nation versus the individual soul. So there's a paradigm shift that happens. And horoscopic astrology is really built for the individual. But electional astrology has been used both for the individual and for the nation. So the nation is always going to be interested in the appropriate time to do something, whether it's going to war or building a new temple in the city somewhere. And so electional astrology, the astrology of timing things, when to do something in order to get a certain kind of result. When should we have our wedding? When should I have a surgery because I want to get such and such result? Electional astrology goes way back. It has a role in ceremonial religious concerns and ceremonial magic concerns, remediational magic, stuff like that. So it's really old. And it plays a role individually too, because we might want to know when is the best time to send an email. If it's a difficult email, maybe a trine from the moon to Venus or Jupiter would be helpful. If you're trying to propose something that might be grandiose and really big, maybe you want to be careful that the moon isn't opposing Jupiter when you write your email. So to me, electional astrology is a way of reflecting on what's happening in the stars and in the planets as a way of sort of modulating what we're doing. It's like just checking in with myself and being like, what am I doing right now? And this astrology will often tell me what I'm doing because I'm unconscious about it. So I think electional astrology is a great it's a great service to the soul insofar as we can use it in that way to align ourselves better with the flow of life, which the planets signify. So I love electional astrology for that reason. I don't like electional astrology. I don't personally use electional astrology for selfish gain, which is where I always think it becomes problematic. When should I start something so that I'll make $1 million? That kind of thing. Each to their own. That's just me. So good question. Thank you for that one. All right, I'm going to move down the list here. What made you interested in astrology, and how did you pick your name? Well, my name was given to me by my guru, my spiritual master. So that it's like the official, sounds like a Jedi or something, spiritual master. But yeah, that's the terminology that's used in India. So yeah, my guru gave me my name. And how did I get interested in astrology? Well, some people know my story, some people don't. I grew up in the church. I was a preacher's kid, and when I was after college, I was a youth pastor, and I worked in a church with kids. And actually, most of my 20s, I worked with kids in after-school mentorship programs in the inner city and Minneapolis, Chicago, down in Georgia. Different times in my life, I spent a lot of time as a camp counselor working with kids, and I wanted to be a pastor, but I also had really never explored. I hadn't taken a nosedive, into the world outside of the church so much, but it was becoming increasingly, I guess, important to me to explore, sort of outside the boundaries of the church. And when I did, I really spun out pretty bad and had a period of addiction. And then randomly during that time, I had a sort of accidental psychedelic experience. I thought I was going to get high, and basically, psychedelic experience reoriented me back toward my roots spiritually, but also added this very it's just a much bigger universe that I was suddenly finding myself in spiritually. It was Christian, but it was also, it had place for a lot of other spiritual paths. Anyway, through that psychedelic experience, I heard about ayahuasca and heard that people used ayahuasca to treat addiction, substance abuse, and other problems, that it could be very healing, that it was very scary. And I had a friend of mine who really wanted to go, and so I ended up going with him to South America. This was I always forget, it's like, I think it was 2004. Anyway, we went to the Amazon, drank in a couple of ceremonies in like 48 hours away from Iquitos, Peru. It was quite an adventure in the jungle, like truly rainforest style ayahuasca, before it had really blown up down there as a big tourist thing. And those ceremonies basically just completely blew my mind and my heart. It was deep reconciliation and healing of my Christian roots, kind of universalizing those Christian experiences that I had, and opening the mind and spirit to a lot of other things. Yoga and astrology came through those ceremonies. And then for many years, when I was first studying astrology and yoga, the development of those studies came through ayahuasca ceremonies, and the people and subjects that I started entertaining or taking in as a result of those ceremonies. And there's so many stories I could share that are really, really, really profound, beautiful experiences that drew me closer to astrology. And it was not an easy path. I was really totally in the closet about it at first. So hope that's a good answer. How to approach intercepted signs? Well, I don't personally look at them, right? Because I use whole sign houses. Ancient astrologers used whole sign houses. That's actually one of, I think, the stronger arguments against using quadrant-based houses, is that dealing with intercepted signs, I kind of think is confusing, and I've never found most of the explanations of how to interpret intercepted signs. I've just never ever found satisfying. Whole sign houses, you're not dealing with that problem in Hellenistic astrology, in Indian astrology. There's ways of looking at the dynamic angles of the chart, and even equal sign houses are fascinating. But you're overlapping dynamical considerations, measuring a planet's strength with determining which topics a planet is signifying vis-a-vis its house location. So angles and houses aren't the same thing, and I think ancient astrologers were a little bit more aware of that than modern astrologers are. That's my hot take. What role does the position of the midheaven play when using a whole sign system? Everyone always asks this. It's such a great question. The angles that you're used to seeing in a quadrant-based house system, like the ascendant, the descendant opposite, the midheaven, and the IC, those degrees are still critical astronomical degrees, but they may fall in, say, the midheaven in 11, 10, or 9 by whole sign. The IC could fall in 3, 4, or 5. And the ascendant will always be in house 1, of course, and the descendant will always be in house 7. But those degrees take on the quality of like a what am I thinking of? Like a power up. They're like a little power up in a video game. When Mario, I don't know, gets like a little mushroom and gets bigger. Like the degrees, the way that I think about them and teach about them in my classes and so forth, is that what they do is they empower a planet. It's sort of like in the sky, the planets are passing through all of these astronomical locations relative to the horizons. When they get to the top of the sky where the latitude is the highest at the midheaven, it's like they suddenly get this big bright halo around them. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean any one thing. It means several things. It means they're speaking more loudly, a concept that was really important to ancient Greek astrologers, a word called krematistikos, which basically has the meaning of speaking loudly. So, if you've ever thrown a tarot spread, sometimes you look and you're like, whoa, look at the world card, or look at the fool right there. There's certain ways in which some cards will really stand out, really catch your eye, really call your attention. In ancient astrology, a planet in angular places by whole sign or at those angles, in a sense, is just drawing your eye to it and saying, strong, bright, loud, pay attention to me. And then the significations of that planet will, in a sense, become stronger, brighter, or louder in the life of the individual. Sometimes it means the planet becomes stronger, but strength isn't always the best way to assess it. So, but that degree will do that to a planet regardless of where it is. It's not determining its topical significations. So, for example, the midheaven has nothing to do necessarily with career. It doesn't necessarily have to do with your vocation. The degree of the midheaven has to do with empowering a planet, making it strong, bright, loud, active, and dynamic. Typically, up in that position of the sky with the latitude, that could include notoriety, fame, success, or infamy. And so people tend to associate it with the career, but it's actually not topically determining anything about the career. It's doing something to a planet. There's a big difference between the two. So the angular degrees don't determine topics. The houses do that. The whole sign houses do that in ancient astrology. But the degrees amplify strength or brightness of the planet, you could say. They make it pop. So that's a simple way of thinking about it. Hello from Salem, Massachusetts. What about the nature of squares of planets to natal nodal axis? Well, there's a long answer to that, because the nodes were treated very differently in ancient astrology compared to the way they are now. So it's not going to be easy to discuss the way a square would work, because it depends on whether the planet is at what's called the north or south bending. The north or south bending are the two different 90-degree markers, and they do and act, planets at those points act very differently. And so it depends on which point it's at. And then it also relates to the nodes in a way that is consistent with what ancient astrologers said about the nodes, which is very different than what modern astrologers say about the nodes. which I've discussed in other videos if you look through my archives on the nodes of the moon. Um, is there anything to know about the nodes being opposite the natal nodes, say North Node Sag? Right. So if you were born with the nodes of the moon in Gemini and Sagittarius, but flipped compared to how they are in the sky right now, so the south node is in Gemini and the north node is in Sagittarius. Well, in terms of tracking the cycles of eclipses, you're in a halfway point of your full nodal cycle, which is like 18 years roughly. So those halfway points are really important turning points in terms of a larger karmic development. Karmic development is not that magical of a phrase. People get like, ooh, karmic development, but you think about it like a garden. There's certain plants that grow in cycles. Their intervals are different in that garden. So the interval of time, the way that time harvests things and brings things around in patterns and works us through different karmic stages that have different kinds of temporal qualities. All planetary cycles are pointing us, cluing us into the tracking of certain patterns in certain intervals. So when you got the nodes flipped, in the simplest way, you're in the midpoint. The midpoint is like a full moon, so it's a culminating point. And from that culmination point, then the dispersing of energy starts to happen. You can use the analogy of a plant. It's probably the best and most common. This is the fruiting, it's the blossoming. And then you harvest what comes from the fruiting. And that's what happens on the second 9 years of the cycle. So it's a critical turning point. And look at those houses in your chart with Sagittarius and Gemini. So that's probably the best simple answer I could give. Hello, what is your opinion about what is your opinion about out of sign aspects? Do they also work, and what is your orb for that? Yeah, another good question. So ancient astrologers had very specific rules for thinking about aspects that are really, really helpful and eliminate a lot of confusion. So one of the basic rules is that any given sign of the zodiac is configured by whole sign to 7 other signs. There's 7 aspectual rays, like the 7 planets, connecting a planet in any sign to 7 other signs. And that's going to be the superior and inferior sextiles, the superior and inferior squares, superior and inferior trines, and the opposition. So we got 7 rays emanating from one planet in one sign to 7 other degrees within 7 other signs. But more fundamental than the degree-based aspect of the planet to 7 other degrees and 7 other signs, which other planets may have proximity to, creating what we call an aspect, are the whole sign configurations. So primarily it's signs that see one another by virtue of shapes within a circle. So when we talk about a sextile, what we're talking about is actually a configuration around the entire circle of certain signs that fit together to build the shape of a hexagon. Now, when 2 planets are connected by virtue of one side of that hexagon, their fundamental level of connection, which we call a sextile, is actually coming from the connection of the whole signs. And in whole sign aspect theory, a planet could be anywhere in Libra, let's say, and have an aspect to a planet anywhere in Leo. Just like 2 whole cards in a tarot spread that see each other from a particular angular connection within the tarot spread, let's say it's a big circular spread, will relate to one another entirely from one part of the card to the next. Because the signs and places were seen as wholes, then a planet in any sign that has aspectual connection to another sign that sees another sign from another part of the circle by means of one of the great shapes, the triangle with the trine or the hexagon with the sextile, that connection will be made. You could have a planet in 1 Libra and 29 Leo, and that would still be considered a sextile in ancient astrology. And then there's a secondary level in which aspects are measured by virtue of degrees, and they have different meanings and different interpretive principles. So you have to understand all of that first, and then you have to move into what it means if there's an application, degree-based application, happening within 3 degrees, let's say, which was the technical range that ancient astrologers had well before there was even such a thing as orbs. And orbs don't come in until much, much later. But typically, the range of application that would be considered for degree-based contacts would be called an engagement within, and it's within 3 degrees. If that's happening right across the sign boundary, typically what it means is that there's a transition that has to happen. And the transition is something that you're actually mapping out from a predictive standpoint. Let me give you a simple example. When Brian Wilson was born with the sun in very late degrees of Gemini. Makes sense. Singer-songwriter, mercurial type. Remember, Hermes, the inventor of the lyre, and he was very mercurial too, and had a couple of planets, Mercury, Sun, and Saturn, all in Gemini. So Brian Wilson, lead singer of the Beach Boys, the sun is at about 28 Gemini, just about ready to cross over the sign boundary into the third whole sign house in his chart, where it will immediately connect in conjunction with exalted Jupiter in Cancer. So the way that we read that in ancient astrology is not like we're not blending the planetary energies. We're actually making a predictive or more concrete statement oftentimes. So, for example, when Brian Wilson's sun moves from the second house into the third and immediately conjoins an exalted Jupiter, we read that predictively. There is going to be some way in which your finances, sun in the second house, become greatly enhanced by the joining together with Jupiter in the third. What might that mean? Well, how about an ultra successful band made up of you and your brothers? The third house, of course, the place of siblings. So an out-of-sign aspect in ancient astrology is almost always being read contextually. Its movement across the sign boundary is indicating that something is happening, and it's more predictive in nature. So that's just a simple example of how out-of-sign aspects are dealt with in ancient astrology. It's very different than modern astrology, where you're looking at those aspects trying to figure out, do these two planets combine or blend in some way to say something, say, about my personality or psychology. So anyway, there's more to it than that, but that's a brief answer. I think every time I give an answer, I'm like, oh, there's more to it. So there is, though, I promise. And that's why you should come study in my course. It starts on June 14th. I promised myself I'd promote it a few times while speaking. So it starts on June 14th. It's called Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic. It's a 1-year class. It's a really amazing experience studying astrology for a full year in depth. By the end of the program, we're hosting live clients and implementing everything we learned too. Early bird rate, $500 off. There's a payment due to COVID-19. We have student sliding hurting financially as well. So check it out. It's nightlightastrology.com. Okay. Why is horary as opposed to whole signs and natal astrology? Great question. I'm not sure if my connection is still okay. Good. So, by the time that horary astrology really started becoming maybe the dominant form of astrology, it was, the medieval era, and quadrant-based houses were more in vogue at that time. So, the simple answer is that most of the way in which people ended up horary concepts were being explained and taught through quadrant-based houses. So for that reason, horary is almost a form that is uniquely reliant upon quadrant-based houses. But that doesn't mean you couldn't do horary with whole sign houses. In fact, I feel like at some point in my career, I'll end up trying it just to see, how it fits, how it works. So I certainly don't, and probably ancient astrologers, use whole sign houses. I don't know if they use whole sign houses in horary in India. That's a question it's a really good question that I've actually never asked. So maybe someone knows out there. Okay. Sun sign versus ascendant. You seem to orient to ascendant as a main personal point over sun sign. Can you discuss that? Sure. Thanks for your question, Scott. So when I'm doing horoscopes, anything horoscopic where it's like, your monthly overview, how the eclipse is going to impact you, something like that. And I talk about which house to look at. I'm always usually saying follow your rising sign. Why? Well, primarily because you want the transits that are being tracked to map to your birth chart. That's the most accurate always. And if you're going by your ascending sign, then whatever houses the transits are being mapped out through will correlate with whole sign houses of your birth chart. So like if you use whole sign houses, which is, very simple to do, you can just look at your, whatever your rising sign is, any monthly overview, the transits that one is tracking throughout the month will perfectly correlate with your birth chart. So that's why I recommend the ascending. If you're using your sun, basically what you're doing is you're taking your sun sign and you're putting it on the ascendant for a monthly horoscope. And if you do that, then all of the transits are taking places in houses that exist relative to a chart that's being cast specifically for putting your sun sign on the ascendant. I just don't think that the sun sign is that important. The reason for that is that in ancient astrology, although the sun is a universal significator and very important, it totally depends on your chart. If you're born during the nighttime, the moon can take on real importance. Your ascendant and your ascendant ruler were always at the top of the list along with the lights anyway. So there's not this unanimous way in which the sun should be privileged, and the ascendant is much more universal in terms of an orienting point for the entirety of your chart. So that's why I privilege it. But, I'm not saying there's nothing to sun sign astrology. It's just not rooted in your birth chart. So that's purely for monthly horoscopes. But when people ask more generally, say psychologically, why do you privilege, say, the ascendant over the sun for a personal point? Because the sun has nothing to do really with your personality or temperament or behavior. In ancient astrology, the sun is more like a description of the plot line in your life. It has more to do with an ideal image or ambition or idea that's driving action in your life. Think about what the sun does when it rises. It moves upward in the sky, goes all the way over from the midheaven way and sets. It's like an arc, like the storyline is like an arc. And the sun's motion was associated with the primary and generative motion of the cosmos, that which impels people to act, the very life force that brings action about. So the sun has more to do with what we do, not necessarily with who we are, which is why ancient astrologers drew that distinction and tended to associate character, behavior, temperament with the ascendant, and sometimes the moon and Mercury. So that's another answer to the sun versus ascendant question. How do you feel about the activity between the planets and what's going on these past few weeks involving the murders? Are people snapping and unable to handle the energies? Well, we've got Jupiter coming back into a conjunction with Pluto. So we're going to see the unleashing of very deep, dark, collective shadows right now. That's a part of the alignment, and people are going to be really triggered by that. Yeah, there's anger. There's anger that makes a lot of sense, some that doesn't. And I said this last night in a social media post. I go back to my Christian roots, it's also yogic, and I remember a verse where I'm gonna see if I can just. No, I don't have it handy. But it's from the 5th chapter of Matthew in the Gospels, and Jesus says, God pours sunshine on the just and the unjust alike, and the wicked and the good. He causes rain to come down on both the wicked and the good. And then he kind of poses the question at the end, if we only love people that love us back or that are lovable, we're really no different than tax collectors. That's kind of their motto. And so there's a call to love people, especially those that we despise or that persecute us or that we have good reason to judge or hate, especially those people who commit flagrant, repeated, endless offenses. For me right now, the practice of Jupiter, Lord of Faith, and Pluto, Lord of the Underworld, is, of course, there's a breakdown of systems of justice. You can see deep forms of prejudice at work in systems in our society. And without getting into it too much more deeply, there's need for reform there. That's a Jupiter-Pluto dynamic. But also there's need for a revival of our faith and also a deepening of our spiritual convictions when faced with our own darkness, which I think the test of that is whether or not we can spend a little time every day, in addition to feeling stressed out, fragged out, angry, even self-righteous, and pray for those that we consider to be our enemies, and pray for our own purification as well. I think that's a really difficult practice right now. But Jupiter Pluto is also the necessity that the world doesn't get better unless we address things at the spiritual root, as well as reforming things. So those two have to go together. That's a Jupiter Pluto dynamic as well. Those are just some thoughts. I'm not any, I'm not some. I don't have any special position that grants me some great insight on it, but that's where I go to in the space of my own sadhana, my daily practices. So hopefully maybe that's helpful. What do I think about the next eclipses? Well, the upcoming eclipse is a dinger. It's got the square to Mars. It's like, oh my God, you can feel it in the air right now. Very Marsy time. The sun is square to Mars. The eclipse will be square to Mars. Venus is going to be square to Mars. Mars is in Jupiter's sign. Jupiter's in its fall with Pluto. It's a very intense and belligerent energy right now, with deep feelings and convictions and ideology and beliefs behind it. So it feels like the cross between like an arena battle in like the ancient world, like Game of Thrones or something, but also deeply ideological. Yeah. So that's the Mars and Pisces T-squaring the upcoming eclipse with Neptune in the mix. Real crusading right now, and some of it's really there's a righteous kind of fury and destructiveness behind it. Like a strong storm that comes through, and it's kind of, what can you say? What can you do when a storm comes through? You just you hope it doesn't impact you personally on some level. You hide from it. It does what it does. Who can argue with it? These energies, and then they pass, and they have a way of being regenerative, I think. So just my thoughts there. Are you well versed in Vedic or Hellenistic astrology? Yeah, I teach Hellenistic astrology. Check out my course, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic. I promised myself I'd promote it a few times, so you can check it out on my website if you want to learn more about it. So I teach a 1-year course, a 2nd-year course, and a full-year horary course. So Hellenistic, and medieval and Renaissance, kind of traditional forms of astrology, as well as modern forms. The first 4 or 5 years of my practice, I practiced, archetypal, psychological, and sort of evolutionary astrology, and then made the switch because I got really deeply interested in classical forms. Anyway, not as much in Vedic astrology. I know some things. I know a lot about, obviously, I shouldn't say a lot, but compared to, I guess, studio for 10 years. So I know something about, about Vedic philosophy, and some about Vedic astrology, mostly on the level of philosophy, but some practical stuff that carries over. So, yeah. Can you explain a solar eclipse landing on the ascendant and main angles affects the chart? Well, solar eclipses are new beginnings. Thanks for your question, Nicholas, or Nicola. So a solar eclipse is a new beginning, but remember, a new beginning that involves the darkening of the light. A new beginning that comes after a period of confusion or destruction, chaos, pain, and suffering are very common for solar eclipses. In the same way that a storm comes through, solar eclipses are very regenerative. They plant new seeds. That's the cliche, but it's really true. It's almost like you can't wear that one out because it's just so true. But it comes with a darkening. It comes with an eclipsing, which can mean some form of struggle or strife or letting go, or facing of the shadow that is a part of the newness that's being born. Sometimes that just means a pretty deep letting go. Yeah. My spiritual, my guru, I'll give you his. There is his email, or there is his website if you want to go check it out. Part of the Bhakti Yoga tradition. His guru, so my great guru, you could say, my grand guru, was A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who brought Bhakti Yoga as the Hare Krishna movement. He brought it to the United States in the 1960s. It was a kind of a cultural yoga revolution time for a lot of people and a lot of different yogic lineages that came over. There's been a lot of change and development within the Hare Krishna movement since the 60s. And they really had to find themselves as a young movement when their guru died. And there was, when Srila Prabhupada passed. So there was a lot of period of, I don't know what I would call it. Younger people who were on this path, and there was this big international movement, temples all across the world that had come up. They're trying to figure out how to do things. I imagine it must be similar to what happens, like what happened, for example, when after Jesus died, and the confusion and all the different chaos that can come when a great unifying leader suddenly leaves their body. I'm not saying that, not comparing the two people in a one-to-one way, just in this particular way, I think that the Hare Krishna tradition in the United States has grown and changed a lot over time, had a lot of growing pains. So a lot of people, are like, when I tell people that, they're like, those Hare Krishnas are still around, And I didn't really realize they were either until I found out that my favorite yoga teacher, who I ended up had gotten into the Bhakti Yoga movement of the 60s. So that's how I got into it. Do I think it's bad to view an eclipse? I'm a little superstitious about it. I don't know if it is or isn't, but let me tell you a story. So I was in India, and I was speaking at an East meets West astrology conference in Calcutta. After that, or right before that, I had gone on pilgrimage to a famous Bhakti Yoga city called Mayapur. And when I was in Calcutta, the Indian astrologers, of course, were all talking about how one should not look at the eclipses. And there was a lunar eclipse while we were there at the conference. Well, I had taken it not so seriously. And I wanted to see it. So I went outside and I looked at it. And I had this weird, ominous feeling like I'm not in my home turf astrologically. Maybe I should listen to what the Indian astrologers are saying, but I didn't. So the next day, this was late at night, and the next day, I went to a temple. I went to the Dakshineswar temple, I think it was called, convent, and I think I cut out there. Let me just make sure I'm still on. Can you all still hear me? Okay, there we go. It seemed like I cut out for a second. Anyway, so I went to this Dakshineswar temple, which was the home of Sri Ramakrishna. And I just always liked him and wanted to go check out his temple. And I went up there, and the taxi driver tried to rip me off. And it was very flagrant, and I was like not having it. So I was like, kind of just, I'm not a scream at someone person, but I would say I hit my version of cursing someone out. And I felt really bad about it right away. And anyway, I was walking to the temple after he dropped me off, and I spent some time there. And then when I came back to catch a taxi to take me back to the hotel, I noticed that there was this big plume of smoke going up, on the highway down the road. And I got in a taxi and ended up getting stuck in traffic for a really long time. And I was terrified the whole time. Like, what if I kind of cursed this person, with nastiness, and then they've gotten an accident? Not that I'm powerful enough to cause an accident, but it's like, you just think, wow, there's clearly been a major accident, and what if I contributed to it by sending someone hate? You know what I mean? Even if I had some beef that was totally legit, he was totally trying to rip me off. So I was like, I just felt really bad about it, and I was worried for a long time on the way home until we found out what had happened, that maybe what if that taxi driver, so it really like haunted me. Anyway, so it turned out that there was a bus on the highway that had hit several kids who were on bicycles and killed them. And the bus driver, I think, if I remember correctly, tried to run, or there was something like that. Anyway, it caused a riot, and a group of people turned the bus over, and it lit on fire, and it blocked a huge main avenue in Calcutta. And this was like, if I remember the story correctly, anyway, this was just right after the eclipse, and it was the day after. So this was like, but anyway, this was one of the moments where it really, like, I really became alert to the fact that these eclipses, when you behold them, there is a way in which you're participating more directly with one of the more ominous signs in astrology. I'm not saying that you should be freaked out about it, because that's probably not right, but I do think that they're powerful and one should be mindful. Like, I would say that I became very aware of the degree to which I was acting flippantly in relation to the eclipse, and then I sort of flippantly said this thing to this taxi driver because I was pissed off, and I realized that, like, flippancy around eclipses is not a good idea. So, interesting story. All right, I'm gonna wrap it up pretty soon, but I see what other questions are in here that I could take in maybe like a lightning round. Is the 8th house always bad? No. The 8th house has a lot to do with karmic debt, things that are owed to us by other people or that we owe to other people. And these things can be very, very good and very fortunate, and can really bless us. For example, when Jupiter entered my 8th house, which is a benefic, granted, but when Jupiter entered Sagittarius in my 8th whole sign house, I came into some inheritance from a number of different people. And these were not just like, oh, cool, some money, other people's money. No, these were very deep things that were given. Some of them monetary, others not, and they were very deep blessings. So I always remember that particular transit in recent memory, anyway, because a lot of people think of the 8th house as just death. Well, why is it death? Well, one of the reasons that the 8th house is associated with death is because we all have one karmic debt that nobody gets out of, and that's our life. We all die. That's the main debt. And the reason that it's associated with debt and death together is very interesting, and that's something that we talk about in depth in my class. So I would take a little pause again to just point people over there. If you like the stuff that I teach, if you think it's interesting and you feel like you really want to get a foundation for your learning, check out my class, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic. It starts on June 14th. It's a year-long, 30 classes, about 3 hours each. Last 10 classes, we have a lot of live guests in, so you can see all of the ancient techniques applied in practice. So check that out. Yeah, in class, we talk about the 8th house and how it came to be associated with those particular topics. And it's really interesting. In short, the planet, by its secondary motion, is trying to move away from the inevitable setting that the primary motion is bringing it down to in the western horizon. So that resistance against the inevitable, or the thing that inevitably is resolved. The 7th house was called Deuces, which one of the meanings of Deuces has this the connotation of something resolving. The sun rises in the east, completes in the west. So the 7th house has a lot to do with completion. It's one of the reasons it's associated with marriage too. It's not so much that it's it has something to do with other people, as much as it is about the consummation of marriage, as in sex, the marriage chamber, the consummation of the sexual relationship that comes after the wedding ceremony, when the sun sets, or rises and then sets. And Deuces, a planet disappearing below the 7th house cusp, the descendant, it's disappearing into the underworld. So you're seeing something enter into, which is one of the meanings of the word deuces as well. And that's also a visual of sex, of penetration, of something going into. And so that's why it comes to be associated with sex and marriage. But in a broader sense, the seventh house is also connected to that which is inevitable, including death. The seventh house and the setting place was also associated with death. And so planets in the eighth house are trying to get away from that by virtue of ascending upward, but then the primary motion brings them downward and makes them set, even though their secondary planetary motion through the zodiac wants to go upward. So that's why it's a place of debts and death. The two things come together. There's a lot of involvement with other people in those topics because debt is social. It's karmic, but it's social in this world. And of course, the one great debt we have existentially is the form that we've taken has an expiration date. So struggle as we may to resist the natural flow of life, the eighth house will tax us, will penalize us, will eventually kill us, right? But also gives us the blessings that eventually come to us, that are meant for us or are destined for us. And that's why it's associated with inheritance. But inheritance is too narrow a term for the kinds of blessings that the eighth house also bestows. As when something reaches resolution or ending, there's often benefit. Like when you finish, a level on a video game and you get like some gold coins or something like that. The eighth house has something like that too. So okay, well, never a short answer. Sorry, I thought I could do a lightning round and I failed. Let's see here. What's this one of the strangest things you've encountered in a birth chart? Boy, I don't know. I've seen a lot of stuff. I think I met at one point. I think I realized I've done somewhere between 10 and 15,000 readings. So, you see so many things, and it's hard to narrow it down. One time, I can tell you one thing that's funny. This is actually a true story. So one time I was doing, okay, there's two things. Once I read backstage at the American Music Awards, and I read Wyclef's chart, and that was really cool. Then I was reading the chart of a publicist who she was a publicist, and that's all she told me. And ended up reading her chart or whatever, and this guy was sitting next to me during the reading, and it turns out that it was Bob Weir from the Grateful Dead, and it was his publicist. And so I was sitting next to Bob Weir reading his publicist's chart, and I didn't know who he was at first because I'm not like my wife would like when she heard that she was like, I can't believe like you didn't know who Bob Weir. She loves the Grateful Dead. So anyway, that was a memorable experience. But no, the experience that I'll never forget was this. So I did, and this is a true story. I'm not going to name names because of confidentiality. But oftentimes when I do a reading, I'll be like, okay, these themes, they're going to be really important for you in your life journey. And kind of go through those. And then I'll illustrate a time period when I think that those themes were really activated, maybe a few of them, just to give a feeling for the person, so that they say, oh yeah, like that narrative, yeah, that's right on, and yeah, this time, those were really active expressions of this life theme that you're talking about. I think people really like having that kind of experience, so sometimes I do that in readings. Anyway, so I did it for this guy, and I was like, you were really dealing with, enemies in the workplace, and you were really dealing with like, your career was blowing up. It looks like it had something to do with like the arts, or maybe something, something artistic or creative. It was blowing up, but you were dealing with enemies at the time, blah, blah, blah. So it was even a little bit more specific than that. So this person happened. And I was reflecting back, if I remember correctly, it was like the 80s or maybe like the early 90s. But this person was, one, and I didn't know who this person was, and in fact they didn't use their real name with me either, which was clever on their part. But this person was one of the most active and important members of a very famous musical group that was dealing with the East Coast, West Coast grudge matches between R&B and hip hop artists at the time, and had saw some death actually. And this is stuff that was like, in the news back in the day, and they were involved with it firsthand. And I'll just never forget being like, when they opened up and then told me who they were and what had happened in the reading, I was like, whoa, that's crazy. Like, you just don't know who you're, over 10 years of doing this full time, you just don't always know who you're reading for. So, that was really memorable to be able to see something. But, I had a version of it in my head. It was so different than that, it turned out to be like the Hollywood version of that story that I was telling. So that was a really memorable experience. Well, let's see. Anything else? Yeah, sorry, I'm not trying to drop names, but the Wyclef reading was really cool though at the AMAs. Like, I got pictures taken with him and stuff like that. The reading was like 5 minutes long. It was not a big deal, but that was like definitely a cool, like, I mean, even I was like, I had to hold it together because I was totally starstruck. Um, those events, by the way, those gifting suites, that's an interesting scene. I'll say that. It's interesting. It's like celebrities live in a different world. A different world. They just get to walk into a room at these elaborate, events, and literally just get handed bags full of stuff. And not just little stuff like Gucci bags and jewelry and free trips to elaborate resorts in tropical locations. Like, pretty amazing what those suites give people. Anyway, that's an aside. Um, so yeah, I think that's it. I'll say goodbye to you all now. I hope this Q&A has been fun and interesting. Thank you all for supporting my work. At the end of the year, I typically hold a fundraiser for people who like my YouTube work, so that'll come around at the end of the year. I'll try to do, lots of good content over the summer here coming up for you guys. Feel free to shoot me an email and tell me what you want to hear more about. info@nightlightastrology.com. I'm also, rallying people to come and check out my programs. Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, again, begins June 14th. You can check it out on my website, nightlightastrology.com, under the courses tabs. If you have any questions about those courses, feel free to email me. There's an early bird discount that's $500 off, a payment plan, and then there's need-based tuition for people who are struggling at all because of COVID. So welcome you to check that out if you need it. Love to see some of you in class. And yeah, it's just it's a pleasure to hang out with and get to know so many of you and read your stories, and has a deep impact on my life and on the way that I become a better person because of what I share with all of you and what you all share with me. So thank you very much. Take it easy. Bye.